There are escapes that seem to defy all reason. Escapes that, when examined closely, appear to violate every law of probability, every limit of human endurance, every barrier that geography and cruelty can possibly construct. The escape of Solomon Northup was one of those rare cases, not because he fled through swamps or overpowered his captors, but because he accomplished something far more unlikely. He persuaded the very system designed to erase his identity that he had never ceased to exist at all. In 1853, a man walked off a plantation in Louisiana carrying nothing more than a single letter. 12 years earlier, he had been a free citizen of New York, a professional violinist, a husband and a father, a man who possessed legal documents proving his freedom. Then, in one night in Washington, D.C., he disappeared completely. When he emerged more than a decade later, he had endured conditions that broke or killed most men within months. The brutal cotton plantations of Deep South, where the average life expectancy of field labor was scarcely 7 years. What causes historians to pause, what makes this case so unsettling, is not simply that Solomon survived. His story has been examined for more than a century, and scholars still struggle with the same questions. Solomon did not merely endure. He engineered an escape so complex, so dependent on precise timing, and a chain of near-impossible coincidences, that experts have spent decades trying to unravel how it truly happened. His freedom required a white man to risk his own life, a letter to travel hundreds of miles without interception, and a legal system that had every incentive to deny his claims to suddenly and inexplicably recognize them. The details of those 12 lost years, what Solomon witnessed, what he suffered, and most disturbingly, what he learned about the inner workings of slavery, would later become one of the most important first-hand accounts in American history. Yet the escape itself remains wrapped in unanswered questions. How does a man survive 12 years of systematic dehumanization without losing his sense of self? How does he preserve hope when every legal, social, and physical force tells him that hope is meaningless? And perhaps most perplexing of all, how does he manufacture freedom from inside a system specifically designed to make freedom unattainable? Before we continue with the story of Solomon Northup and the impossible sequence of events that led to his liberation, if you enjoy mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a like if you want more stories that force you to question what really happened. And tell us in the comments which state or city you're listening from. Now, let's return to where it all began, not in Louisiana, but in a place where Solomon believed himself completely safe. The answers to these questions are not found in a single dramatic moment of escape, but in a series of deliberate choices, extraordinary risks, and coincidences so improbable they feel almost as if they were guided by fate itself. This is a story of how one man refused to be erased, and how the simple act of remembering who became the key to his survival. Saratoga Springs, New York, in the spring of 1841, was a town alive with prosperity and expectation. Set along the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, it had evolved from a quiet settlement into one of the most fashionable destinations in the northeastern United States. The mineral springs that rose naturally from the ground have been known to the Mohawk people for generations, but by the 1840s they formed the backbone of a booming resort economy. Wealthy families arrived from New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and even from southern cities like Charleston. Each summer brought a flood of visitors who filled the grand hotels lining Broadway. The United States Hotel, Congress Hall, the Columbian, establishments that rivaled the finest accommodations in Manhattan for elegance and refinement. With those visitors came an endless demand for entertainment. Orchestras, theater troupes, dance masters, and musicians of every kind were in constant demand. For a skilled violinist, Saratoga Springs during the season offered the opportunity to earn a respectable and steady income. Solomon Northup had built exactly such a life. At 33 years old, he was of medium height with a strong, capable frame, alert eyes, and hands that moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting craft. He had been born in Minerva, New York, in July of 1808, the son of Moses Northup, a formerly enslaved man who had been emancipated by his owners in the 1790s. That single legal fact, that his father had been freed before Solomon's birth, meant that Solomon entered the world as a free man, a status that carried real legal authority in New York State. Moses Northup worked as a farmer and raised his children with a firm understanding of what freedom meant and how easily it could be taken away. He taught Solomon to read and write, skills that were far from universal even among free black citizens in the early 19th century. He stressed the importance of documentation, of safeguarding papers that prove one's status, and of understanding the law well enough to protect oneself. He also taught his son a trade, music, that allowed him to move within white society with a level of independence and respect that was exceedingly rare for black men of that era. Solomon married in Hampton in 1829 when he was 21 years old and was of mixed ancestry, the daughter of a free black woman and a white man, and she possessed a quiet resilience and practical intelligence that balanced Solomon's more outgoing personality. Together, they created a life that, while modest compared to the wealth of Saratoga's seasonal visitors, was stable and comfortable within their own community. They had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Elizabeth, the oldest, was 12 years old in the spring of 1841, a bright and capable girl who assisted her mother with cooking and household tasks. Margaret was 10, more reserved than her sister, but no less perceptive. Alonzo, at 7 years old, already showed signs of inheriting his father's musical ability. The family lived in a small home that Solomon owned outright, a remarkable accomplishment for any working man at the time, and especially significant for a free black man. Solomon's reputation as a musician had spread throughout the region. He played the violin with a level of skill born of both natural talent and years of disciplined practice. He performed at weddings, political meetings, holiday gatherings, and elaborate balls held at the grand hotels during the summer months. He was familiar with the popular music of the day, waltzes, reels, contra dances, and he could read sheet music, which allowed him to master new compositions with ease. His patrons included some of the most influential figures in the area: judges, merchants, attorneys, and local politicians. They knew him personally, recognized him on sight, and trusted him. That reputation was more than a way to earn a living. In a society where free black citizens occupied a fragile legal and social position, reputation itself functioned as a form of protection. Solomon was regarded as dependable, skilled, and respectable. He paid what he owed, honored his commitments, and avoided conflict. Local officials were familiar with him. The sheriff knew him by name. Judges who sat on the county courts recognized him. This web of familiarity and respect often mattered more than the freedom papers he kept carefully secured in his home, and earned money as a cook, working primarily in hotels and the private homes of affluent families. She was known for her ability to prepare traditional dishes and for managing large meals for banquets and social gatherings. During the busy summer months, when Saratoga Springs was crowded with visitors, her wages could be substantial. Winters were leaner, work was inconsistent, and the family lived more cautiously, but they made do. The Northups attended the local Baptist church, where they belonged to a small yet established community of free black families. In 1841, Saratoga Springs was home to perhaps 50 or 60 free black residents, most employed as laborers, domestic servants, cooks, or skilled tradesmen. By the standards of the era, it was a relatively tolerant environment. New York State had abolished slavery gradually between 1799 and 1827, and by the early 1840s, it supported a sizable population of free black citizens who possessed certain legal rights, including the ability to own property, bring lawsuits, and vote, provided they met specific property requirements. But tolerance was not equality, and Solomon understood the limits that shaped his life. He could perform music in the grand hotels, but he could not reside in them as a guest. He could vote, but only because he owned property. Most black men in New York were barred from voting by property requirements deliberately structured to restrict their political influence. He could walk freely through town, but he knew that traveling south, even into nearby states like Pennsylvania or New Jersey, placed him at risk, where his freedom papers might be questioned or ignored. He also knew that professional kidnappers operated even in northern states, men who specialized in abducting free black people and selling them into slavery in the South. This was the world Solomon Northup lived in during March of 1841. A life of relative stability built on reputation, paperwork, and careful navigation of social boundaries. It felt orderly, predictable, and secure, and it was about to collapse entirely. The proposal came in late March, as winter finally began to release its hold on upstate New York. Two men approached Solomon in Saratoga Springs, introducing themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They were neatly dressed, personable, and spoke with the ease of men accustomed to conducting business. They explained that they were connected to a traveling circus company moving south through New York State and into Washington, D.C. The circus featured trained horses, acrobatic acts, and various entertainments, and they were in need of musicians to accompany performances. They claimed to have heard of Solomon's reputation as a violinist and offered him favorable terms, $1 per day, with all travel expenses covered. The engagement would last only a few weeks. The route would take them through Albany, then down to New York City, and finally to Washington, D.C., where the circus was scheduled to perform for several days before returning north. Solomon would be home in Saratoga Springs by early April, well before the start of the summer season. It was an appealing offer. $1 a day was solid pay. And with expenses paid, Solomon could save most of his earnings, and was preparing to travel to Sandy Hill, a town roughly 30 miles north, where she had secured temporary work as a cook for a wealthy family. The children would stay with relatives during that time. The timing appeared ideal. Solomon would be gone only briefly, earning extra money, and would return just as he came home and the busy season began. He discussed the opportunity with Anne. Cautious by nature, she raised the practical questions any careful person would ask. Did he know these men? Were they trustworthy? Was there anything in writing? Solomon admitted that he had only just met Brown and Hamilton, but they appeared legitimate. They carried money, spoke convincingly, and offered references from other musicians who had reportedly worked with the circus. As for a written agreement, such contracts were not always customary for short-term entertainment work, and remained uneasy, but she also understood their circumstances. The money would help. Solomon was accustomed to travel. He had performed throughout the region and knew how to look after himself. Most importantly, he would carry his free papers with him, official documentation proving his status as a free man. If any questions arose, he could present those papers and resolve the matter. In Solomon's mind, they were sufficient protection. He agreed to take the job. He packed a small bag with clothing, his violin, and his free papers, a document issued by the county clerk, bearing official seals and signatures. The papers listed his age, height, complexion, and confirmed that he was a free man born in New York. They were his safeguard, his proof of identity, the evidence he believed would shield him from harm. On March 20th, 1841, Solomon Northup departed Saratoga Springs with Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. He kissed and goodbye, promised to write once he reached Washington, and set out on what he believed would be a short and profitable journey. He had no reason to think he would not see his family again for 12 years. He had no reason to doubt that the two agreeable men traveling beside him were anything other than what they claimed. And he had no way of knowing that his free papers, the documents he trusted completely, would become meaningless the moment he crossed into Washington, D.C. The journey south began pleasantly. They traveled by stagecoach and steamboat, stopping first in Albany and then in New York City. Brown and Hamilton were agreeable companions, and they paid Solomon promptly for performances. In New York City, they stayed at a hotel near the waterfront, and Solomon played for small audiences in taverns and meeting halls. The circus shows were modest but drew respectable crowds, and Solomon's violin playing was met with genuine appreciation. From New York City, the journey continued southward. York City, they traveled by steamboat down the coast, and then up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. In 1841, the nation's capital was a peculiar blend of lofty ambition and unfinished reality. The Capitol building and the White House stood as symbols of what the young republic aspired to become, yet much of the surrounding city remained rough and undeveloped. Streets turned to mud after rain, buildings were scattered and inconsistent, and the population shifted constantly as politicians, lobbyists, clerks, and laborers arrived and departed with each congressional session. Beneath the image of power and progress, Washington was also one of the largest slave trading centers in the United States. Despite serving as the seat of the federal government, the city openly permitted slavery and contained several slave pens where men, women, and children were confined before being sold and shipped to plantations in the Deep South. By the 1840s, the domestic slave trade had become a massive industry, fueled by the booming cotton economy in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Demand for enslaved labor was so intense that traders paid premium prices, creating a profitable market for kidnapping free black people in northern states and selling them south. Solomon was aware of this reality, but he trusted that his freedom papers would protect him. He had traveled before without incident. Washington, after all, was the capital of the United States. Surely the law would be honored there. Brown and Hamilton arranged accommodations at a hotel near the Capitol. On their second evening in the city, March 24th, 1841, they invited Solomon to dine with them at a nearby tavern. They described it as a celebration. The performances had gone well, they said, and the evening was meant to mark their success. Food and drinks were ordered, the mood was relaxed, and conversation flowed easily. Solomon drank wine, something he did only on rare occasions. He remembered feeling unusually warm, then lightheaded. Soon the room seemed to spin. He excused himself, believing he needed fresh air, but the dizziness worsened. He recalled stumbling, hands gripping his arms to steady him, and then nothing at all. When consciousness returned, it did so in broken fragments. Pain, darkness, the cold, sour smell of damp stone, the metallic rattle of chains. Solomon tried to move and realized his wrists and ankles were bound in iron shackles. His head pulsed with such severe pain that forming coherent thoughts was difficult. He called out, and his voice echoed unnaturally in the darkness. Slowly, as his eyes adjusted, he began to see stone walls, a thick wooden door pierced by a small barred opening, and the dim outlines of other bodies lying on the floor nearby. He was in a slave pen, and according to men who now controlled him, he had always been enslaved. The pen stood on 7th Street in Washington, D.C., less than a mile from the Capitol itself. It was owned and operated by James Birch, a professional slave trader who had been in the business for many years. His establishment was one of several such facilities in the city and functioned openly with the full knowledge and tacit approval of local authorities. In 1841, slavery was legal in Washington, D.C., and the slave trade was considered a legitimate, if increasingly contested enterprise. The pen was a bleak structure, a 2-story brick building with barred windows and reinforced doors. The lower level held several large rooms where captive people were confined while awaiting shipment. Conditions were intentionally brutal. Minimal food, no proper bedding, and constant surveillance. The goal was not only to restrain bodies but to crush resistance, to break the will of anyone who might assert they were free. Solomon's first clear memory after awakening in the pen was of James Birch standing over him. Birch was in his 40s, dressed like a successful businessman, his eyes cold and his manner practiced, as if he conducted this routine countless times before. He asked Solomon his name. Still dazed but beginning to grasp the horror of his situation, Solomon told him the truth. His name was Solomon Northup. He was a free man from Saratoga Springs, New York. He had legal papers proving his freedom. There had been a terrible mistake, and he needed to contact his family, his lawyer, anyone who could confirm who he was. Birch responded calmly, almost patiently. He informed Solomon that his name was not Solomon Northup. His name was Platt. He was a runaway slave from Georgia who had been captured and returned to his rightful owner. Any claim otherwise was a lie, and lies would be punished. Solomon protested. He described his home, his wife, his children. He named respected figures in Saratoga Springs, judges, merchants, officials who could verify his identity. He demanded to see his free papers, which he had carried with him from New York. Birch listened without visible reaction. Then he left the room and returned with 2 other men and a wooden paddle. What followed was a beating so violent that Solomon lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was alone in the cell, his back and legs swollen with welts and torn skin. Even the simple act of breathing sent waves of pain through his body. Over the next hours, as the agony eased enough for him to think, Solomon began to comprehend the full scope of what had been done to him. Brown and Hamilton had drugged him. The wine at dinner had been laced with something, likely laudanum or another opiate. While he lay unconscious, they had taken his free papers and sold him to Birch. Those documents were now destroyed or concealed, and without them, Solomon had no proof of who he truly was. In the eyes of the law, he was property. Birch possessed paperwork, bills of sale, ownership records, identifying him as an enslaved man named Platt. Solomon's testimony, the word of a black man claiming freedom, carried no weight against Birch's documents. Even if Solomon somehow managed to send word to New York, even if someone came searching for him, Birch's papers would be accepted as legitimate unless Solomon could produce his own to refute them. And those papers no longer existed. The other captives in the pen confirmed what Solomon was beginning to understand. This was not unusual. Free black people were regularly kidnapped in northern cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, drugged, beaten, or deceived and sold to traders like Birch. These traders relied on networks of accomplices who identified potential victims, lured them with job offers or false promises, and delivered them to the pens. Once inside, any proof of freedom was destroyed, new identities were assigned, and within days or weeks the victims were sold and transported south, where they vanished into the vast plantation system, rarely to be heard from again. System of the Deep South. The law offered no protection at all. In Washington, D.C., as in most of the country at the time, the testimony of black people was not admissible in court when offered against white citizens. Even if Solomon could somehow bring charges against Birch or against Brown and Hamilton, he would not be allowed to testify. And without testimony, there could be no case. The legal system existed to protect property rights, and within that system, Solomon himself was now considered property. Solomon spent 2 weeks inside Birch's pen. During that time, he was beaten twice more for continuing to insist that he was free. These punishments were not random bursts of violence. They were deliberate, calculated acts meant to crush his will. Birch wanted enslaved people who were obedient, who had accepted their condition, who would not cause trouble for buyers. Any resistance was met quickly and savagely. Yet those beatings also taught Solomon something essential. He could not win through defiance. The system was too vast, too deeply rooted. If he was going to survive, if he was ever going to escape, he would need to be strategic. He would have to appear compliant, to perform a role expected of him, while quietly preserving his identity and his memory of who he truly was. He would have to wait for an opening, however remote, that might allow him to reclaim his freedom. In early April, Solomon was moved from Washington to Richmond, Virginia, along with roughly 40 other enslaved people. They were chained together in pairs and marched to the streets of Washington in full daylight, past the Capitol building, past government offices, past citizens who watched with either indifference or approval. The domestic slave trade was so normalized in the capital that such scenes barely registered as remarkable. In Richmond, the group was confined in another slave pen for several days before being loaded onto a ship called the Orleans. The vessel was bound for New Orleans, the largest slave market in the Deep South. The voyage lasted nearly 2 weeks, and the conditions were unbearable. The captives were forced below deck into a space so cramped they could scarcely move. The air was suffocating, heavy with the stench of sweat and human waste. Food and water were scarce, and sickness spread quickly. 2 people died during the journey: a young woman who had already been ill when they boarded, and an older man who seemed simply to lose the will to live. Their bodies were carried up to the deck and thrown into the sea without ceremony, without prayer, without any acknowledgement that they had once been human beings with names, families, and histories. Solomon watched this and understood that he was witnessing a system of dehumanization so complete that people were reduced to cargo, to economic units, to objects that could be discarded the moment they ceased to be profitable. He also understood that survival required resistance of a different kind. He would resist by remembering, by holding on to his identity, his past, his sense of self, even if he could never speak it aloud. The Orleans reached New Orleans in late April of 1841. The city was a commercial heart of the Deep South, a thriving port where cotton, sugar, and enslaved people were bought and sold in enormous quantities. The slave market lay near the docks, a collection of buildings and open yards where traders displayed human beings for inspection. Solomon and the others were taken to one of these markets, owned by a dealer named Theophilus Freeman. There, they were washed, dressed in clean clothing, and instructed on how to behave when buyers arrived. Freeman was direct. They were to appear healthy, strong, and obedient. Any sign of illness, injury, or defiance would reduce their value. Anyone who caused trouble would be beaten. For several days, Solomon stood in Freeman's yard as buyers examined him. They checked his teeth, his hands, his muscles. They questioned him about his age, his health, his experience with labor. Solomon answered carefully, revealing as little as possible, trying to strike a balance between intelligence and ignorance. Too much intelligence made buyers wary. Educated enslaved people were seen as dangerous, while too little intelligence reduced a person's usefulness for skilled work. In early May, Solomon was purchased by a man named William Ford. Ford was a Baptist minister who owned a sawmill and several thousand acres of pine forest in the Bayou Boeuf region of central Louisiana. He paid $1,000 for Solomon, a substantial sum that reflected Solomon's apparent strength and good health. By the standards of the time and place, Ford was regarded as a comparatively humane enslaver. He did not rely excessively on the whip. He provided sufficient food and shelter and allowed the people he enslaved to attend religious services. But Ford was still a slaveholder, and whatever kindness he showed existed entirely within a system that defined human beings as property. He owned Solomon completely, and that ownership was unquestioned. Solomon was taken to Ford's plantation, traveling for several days by boat and wagon through the swamps and forests of central Louisiana. The landscape was unlike anything he had known in New York. Endless cypress swamps, dense pine woods, and an oppressive heat that made every movement exhausting. The plantation itself lay miles from the nearest settlement, reachable only by rough roads that dissolved into mud during frequent rains. Ford assigned Solomon to work in the lumber operation, cutting and hauling pine logs. The labor was grueling, but Solomon was strong, and he adapted quickly to the demands of the work. Ford noticed Solomon's intelligence and soon began entrusting him with greater responsibility, overseeing other workers, managing tasks, solving practical problems. For a brief period, Solomon allowed himself to hope that Ford might be different, that he might listen if Solomon ever revealed the truth about his past. But Solomon watched him closely, and what he saw was a man caught in contradiction. Ford appeared sincerely religious and seemed to believe that slavery could be practiced in a Christian way, that masters had an obligation to treat enslaved people with a measure of kindness and to care for their spiritual lives. Yet he never questioned the foundation of slavery itself. He never considered that owning another human being might fundamentally conflict with Christian principles. And he never showed any indication that he would risk his finances or his social position to help an enslaved man claim freedom. Solomon chose patience. He would observe and wait, but he would not disclose his past to Ford. The danger was too great. If Ford did not believe him, or if Ford reported him to the authorities, Solomon could be sold to an even harsher owner or killed outright as a troublemaker. That chance never came. In late 1842, Ford fell into serious financial trouble. He had borrowed heavily to expand his lumber business and was unable to repay his debts. Creditors demanded immediate payment, and Ford was forced to liquidate assets, including some of the people he enslaved. To satisfy one of those debts, Solomon was sold to a carpenter named John Tibiats. The sale marked a decisive turning point. If Ford represented the most tolerable version of slavery, a man who avoided needless cruelty, provided basic necessities, and acknowledged the humanity of those he owned while still denying their freedom, then Tibiats embodied something far more dangerous. He was volatile and violent, a man who seemed to derive pleasure from inflicting pain. He beat his slaves for trivial mistakes, perceived slights, or no reason at all. He was especially hostile toward Solomon, perhaps because he sensed Solomon's intelligence and education beneath the carefully maintained mask of submission. The tension reached a breaking point in the summer of 1843. Tibiats accused Solomon of performing a task incorrectly, a minor disagreement over how a fence should be constructed. The issue itself was insignificant, but Tibiats used it as an excuse to whip him. Pushed beyond endurance, Solomon fought back. He seized the whip and struck Tibiats several times before other workers intervened and forced them apart. It was an act of self-defense, but under Louisiana law it was a capital offense. An enslaved person who struck a white man could be executed, and the master was legally permitted to carry out the execution without a trial. Tibiats, furious and humiliated, left to fetch a rope, making his intentions unmistakably clear. Solomon fled. He ran into the swamp surrounding the plantation, wading through water that reached his waist, hiding among cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. He spent the night in the swamp, surrounded by snakes and alligators, listening to the distant sounds of men and dogs searching for him. He knew that capture meant death, but he also understood that he could not survive indefinitely in the swamp. He had no food, no shelter, and the environment itself was deadly. At dawn, exhausted and desperate, Solomon made a decision that seemed irrational but may have been his only chance. He returned to William Ford's plantation and begged for protection. Ford, who still held a financial interest in Solomon as partial collateral for Tibiats' debt, intervened. He negotiated with Tibiats, and eventually a resolution was reached. Solomon would be sold again, this time to a planter named Edwin Epps. It was not freedom. It was not even safety, but it was survival. And for Solomon, survival was the only form of resistance left to him. Edwin Epps' plantation lay deep within the Bayou Boeuf region of central Louisiana, an isolated landscape of swamps, forests, and scattered cotton fields. The plantation functioned as a self-contained world, cut off from outside oversight and ruled entirely by Epps' authority. Solomon's arrival there in late 1843 marked the beginning of a new phase of captivity, one that would last nearly 10 years and push him to the very limits of human endurance. Epps was in his early 40s, of medium height with a wiry build and a face perpetually hardened by suspicion and anger. Born poor, the son of a small farmer, he had clawed his way into relative prosperity through relentless labor, ruthless business practices, and unshakable belief in the racial hierarchy that justified slavery. When Solomon arrived, Epps owned roughly 10 slaves, and he worked them with brutality that stood out even by the standards of the antebellum South. Epps' philosophy of slave management was simple and merciless. Enslaved people were property, no different from animals, and their sole purpose was to generate profit. Their value was measured entirely by how much cotton they could pick each day, and his expectations were enforced with the whip. Every evening, the enslaved workers were required to weigh their cotton. Those who failed to meet their assigned quota, typically 200 pounds for an adult, were whipped. The number of lashes corresponded precisely to the number of pounds they fell short. It was a nightly ritual as predictable as sunset, creating an atmosphere of constant terror. Solomon learned to pick cotton, though he was never as fast as those who've been doing it since childhood. Cotton picking was skilled labor, demanding speed, endurance, and technique. The bolls had to be plucked cleanly without excess plant material, and the work had to be done quickly because the harvest season was short, lasting only a few months between ripening and the arrival of colder weather. An expert picker could gather 300 pounds or more in a single day. Solomon, despite his strength and intelligence, struggled to reach 200, especially during his early years on the plantation. Physical punishment was not Epps's only means of control. He also employed psychological tactics to maintain dominance. He encouraged competition and distrust among the enslaved people, rewarding informants and punishing those who showed solidarity. At times, he forced enslaved individuals to whip one another, making them participants in the violence inflicted upon them. He also used sexual violence as an instrument of power, particularly against the women on the plantation. Among those women was a young enslaved woman named Patsy. She was in her early 20s when Solomon arrived, remarkable both for her beauty and for her extraordinary ability as a cotton picker. She could harvest 500 pounds in a day, more than anyone else, which made her immensely valuable to Epps. But that same value made her a target. Epps developed an obsession with Patsy and subjected her to repeated sexual assaults. His wife, Mary Epps, was fully aware of this. Rather than confront her husband, she directed her fury at Patsy, treating her with extreme cruelty and demanding that Epps punish her for imagined offenses. Solomon witnessed all of this and came to understand that he was living within a system where every human relationship was warped by the underlying violence of slavery. Epps's fixation on Patsy, Mary Epps's jealous hatred, the forced complicity of the other enslaved people. All of it flowed from a structure that reduced human beings to property and granted masters unchecked power over their lives. But Solomon also noticed something else. The plantation was isolated, but it was not completely sealed off from the outside world. From time to time, white men from beyond the region would arrive. Traders, overseers, craftsmen hired for specialized work. They brought news, rumors, and occasionally perspectives that differed from those of the plantation owners. Gradually, Solomon came to understand that if escape were ever possible, it would not come from running into the swamps. It would come from finding someone from outside the system, someone who might be willing to carry a message to New York. The years passed with crushing slowness. Solomon labored in the fields, picked cotton, endured the lash, and performed the role of the obedient enslaved man. He never spoke of his former life. He never claimed to be free. He never gave Epps any reason to suspect that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. But inwardly, he clung to his identity. He remembered his wife's face, his children's names, the streets of Saratoga Springs, the music he had once played. He repeated these memories silently, like prayers, using them to preserve his sense of self in a world designed to erase it. At the same time, he studied the legal and social machinery that made escape nearly impossible. Louisiana law required black people to carry passes signed by their masters if they traveled alone. Without a pass, any white person could stop them, demand proof of their status, and return them to their owner in exchange for a reward. Roads were patrolled by men who earned their living hunting runaways. The surrounding swamps were vast and lethal, and those who fled into them rarely survived. But the greatest obstacle was not physical, it was legal. Solomon had no documents. He had no proof that he had ever been free. Even if he somehow reached New York, he would be traveling as a fugitive slave, vulnerable under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required northern states to return escaped slaves to their claimed owners. Epps, like all slaveholders, possessed legal papers affirming his ownership. In any confrontation between Solomon's word and Epps's documents, the law would side with Epps. Solomon understood this with absolute clarity. He had seen others attempt to run and fail. He had watched men dragged back to the plantation and beaten so severely that they never recovered. He had seen women sold away from their children as punishment for attempting escape. He knew that flight, in the traditional sense, was futile. So he began to imagine a different kind of escape, one that did not involve running at all. If he could not flee slavery, perhaps he could prove that he had never been legally enslaved in the first place. To do that, he would need to send a message to someone in New York who could confirm his identity and bring legal proof of his freedom to Louisiana. But how? He could not write a letter himself. If Epps discovered that he could read and write, The consequences would be severe. Literate slaves were considered dangerous and were often sold farther south or killed. He could not trust other enslaved people with such knowledge. The risk of betrayal, intentional or forced under torture, was too great. He could not approach white men in the region, most of whom were tied to the plantation system, and would report him immediately. He needed someone from outside Louisiana, someone with no stake in slavery, someone willing to take an enormous risk for a stranger. For years, no such person appeared. Then, in the summer of 1852, a white carpenter named Samuel Bass arrived at Epps's plantation to perform construction work. Bass was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with graying hair and a weathered face shaped by years of outdoor labor. Originally from Canada, he had spent much of his adult life traveling through the southern United States as a carpenter and builder. He was highly skilled and known for the quality of his work, which kept him in demand despite his habit of speaking openly about topics most white Southerners considered settled beyond debate. Bass was an abolitionist. He believed slavery was morally wrong, economically inefficient, and incompatible with Christianity and democratic principles. These views were dangerous in Louisiana in 1852, where slavery was not merely an economic system, but a foundation of social order. White men who questioned it were viewed with suspicion, and those who openly opposed it risked violence, prosecution, or social exile. Bass, however, seemed either unable or unwilling to keep his opinions to himself. He argued with slaveholders, pointing out contradictions in their justifications for slavery. He cited scripture, the Declaration of Independence, economic theory, anything that supported his position. Many slaveholders dismissed him as an eccentric or a harmless agitator, but others found him genuinely threatening, and Bass had been driven out of more than one town because of his views. Epps hired Bass to build an addition to his house, a project expected to take several weeks. Bass arrived in late July of 1852 and set up a temporary workshop near the main residence. He worked mostly alone, but at times interacted with the enslaved people, asking them to help move materials or steady boards while he worked. Solomon watched him closely from the start. He noticed how Bass spoke to the enslaved workers, not with casual contempt, as most white men did, but with basic respect, as if he recognized them as people rather than property. Solomon also listened as Bass argued with Epps about slavery. These debates often took place in the evenings after work, fueled by whiskey. In one exchange that Solomon overheard while working near the house, Bass told Epps that slavery was a sin against both God and man, that it corrupted the enslaved and the enslaver alike, and that it would ultimately destroy the South. Epps replied with the familiar defenses. Slavery was sanctioned by the Bible. Black people were inferior and required white supervision. The Southern economy depended on slave labor. Bass countered every argument, his voice rising with intensity until Epps finally ordered him to shut up or leave. Bass did neither. He finished his drink, muttered that Epps was a fool, and returned to work the next morning as if nothing had happened. Solomon witnessed this exchange and began to contemplate a possibility that was both hopeful and terrifying. Samuel Bass might be willing to help him, but the danger was immense. If Solomon revealed his past to Bass and Bass reported him to Epps, Solomon would be beaten, possibly killed. Even if Bass truly opposed slavery, that did not mean he would risk his own safety for an enslaved man he barely knew. And even if Bass agreed to help, there was no assurance that any plan would succeed. For weeks, Solomon observed Bass closely, weighing every word and gesture. He watched how Bass treated the other enslaved people, how he reacted when Epps acted cruelly, how he behaved when he believed no one was watching. Gradually, Solomon came to believe that Bass was sincere, that his opposition to slavery was not empty talk, but a deeply held moral conviction. Still, belief was not certainty, and Solomon knew he would have only one opportunity. If he approached Bass and Bass refused, or worse, if he agreed and later betrayed him, Solomon's position would become far more dangerous. He would be exposed as a troublemaker, a man claiming to be free, and Epps would ensure he never had another chance. In late August, Solomon made his decision. One evening, when Bass was working alone in his temporary workshop, Solomon approached him. His heart raced and his mouth felt dry. He had rehearsed his words countless times, yet now they seemed fragile and insufficient. He began cautiously, asking a simple question. He addressed Bass respectfully and asked where he came from. Bass looked up, surprised. He replied that he had been born in Canada and asked why Solomon wanted to know. Solomon hesitated, then committed himself fully. He said he had been on the plantation a long time, had worked for Epps for many years, but had not been born enslaved. He told Bass he had been born free in New York, kidnapped and brought south, and that he had been searching for a way to send word to his family ever since. Bass stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Solomon felt a surge of terror. He was certain he had made a fatal mistake. Bass was going to report him. Everything was about to unravel. Then Bass spoke quietly and told Solomon to explain everything. Solomon told him his entire story. He described his life in Saratoga Springs, his work as a musician, his wife and children. He explained the job offer from Brown and Hamilton, the journey to Washington, the wine at dinner, and waking up in chains. He recounted the 12 years he had endured in Louisiana, the plantations, the owners, the violence. He gave names, dates, and places, speaking for nearly an hour while Bass listened without interrupting. When Solomon finished, Bass began asking questions. He wanted specifics, the names of people in Saratoga Springs who could confirm Solomon's identity, the exact location of his home, the names of his wife and children. He asked about Solomon's freedom papers, and Solomon explained that they had been destroyed by the slave traders in Washington. At last, Bass leaned back and exhaled slowly. He said that if Solomon's story was true, then he'd been the victim of one of the greatest crimes imaginable. And if Bass could help him, he would. Solomon felt a rush of hope so powerful it was almost overwhelming, but he forced himself to remain steady. He asked how such help could even be possible. Bass thought for a moment and said he could write letters. He could write to people in New York, people Solomon named, and explain where Solomon was and what had happened. If they could verify the story and produce proof of Solomon's freedom, then perhaps something could be done. Solomon warned him of the danger. If Epps discovered what they were doing, the punishment would be severe. Bass interrupted and said he understood the risk. He admitted that he had argued against slavery for years, but had never done more than talk. Perhaps it was time, he said, to do something that actually mattered. Over the next several days, Bass and Solomon met repeatedly, always in secret, always when Epps was away or occupied. Bass wrote letters to the people Solomon identified, merchants, lawyers, acquaintances, anyone who might remember him. He took care with every word, using his own name as a sender and laying out the situation in detail. He described Solomon's appearance, his history, and his exact location. He asked the recipients to verify Solomon's identity and to contact authorities in New York if they believed the account. Bass paid for the postage himself and mailed the letters from Marksville, the nearest town, during a trip to purchase supplies. Bass told Solomon that responses, if they came at all, might take weeks or even months. Letters could be lost. People might have moved away or died. And even if someone received the letters and believed them, there was no guarantee they would be able to help. Solomon understood all of this, but for the first time in 12 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Someone knew who he was. Someone was trying to help him. And even if the letters failed, even if nothing came of them, he had acted. He had refused to accept his captivity in silence. Bass completed his work on Epps's house in early September and left the plantation. Solomon watched him go, wondering if he would ever see him again, wondering whether the letters would reach anyone at all, wondering whether this fragile thread of hope would hold or snap. Then he returned to the fields and waited. The weeks following Bass's departure were the longest of Solomon's life. Each day began before dawn, followed by hours in the cotton fields, and ended with the nightly ritual of weighing and punishment. But now every day carried an added burden of anticipation and dread. Had the letters been delivered? Had anyone read them? Would anyone believe them? And if someone did believe, could they actually do anything? Outwardly, Solomon maintained the same demeanor he had perfected over the years. The obedient, hard-working enslaved man who drew no attention and caused no trouble. He could not allow Epps to suspect that anything had changed. If Epps learned that Solomon had contacted someone beyond the plantation, that letters had been sent north, the retaliation would be swift and merciless. Inside, however, Solomon was consumed by turmoil. Hope and fear warred within him constantly. Hope that someone in Saratoga Springs had received Bass's letter and was taking action. Fear that the letters had been lost, ignored, or dismissed as nonsense. Hope that his wife and children were still alive, still waiting for him. Fear that they had moved on, believing him dead, and that he would fade from memory forever. The cotton-picking season reached its peak in October and November. The weather cooled, the bolls ripened, and Epps drove the enslaved people harder than ever. Solomon picked cotton from before sunrise until long after nightfall, his hands split and bleeding from the sharp edges of the bolls, his back aching from the endless bending and reaching. At night, he lay on the dirt floor of the cabin he shared with others, too exhausted to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of New York, of freedom, and of the impossible distance between where he was and where he longed to be. In November, a white man arrived at the plantation looking for work. He was a drifter, a laborer seeking temporary employment, and Epps hired him to assist with repairs. The man stayed for several days, and Solomon watched him closely, wondering if he might be connected to Bass's letters. But the man showed no sign of recognizing Solomon or knowing anything about his situation. After a short time, he moved on. December arrived, bringing the end of the cotton season. Work shifted to repairing fences, clearing land, and preparing for the next planting. The pace eased slightly, but the whippings continued for any perceived offense. Epps was in a foul mood that winter, drinking heavily and venting his anger on the people he enslaved. As weeks passed, Solomon's hope began to fade. 3 months had gone by since Bass had mailed the letters. If anyone in New York had received them and believed them, surely something would have happened by now. Someone would have come. Someone would have sent word. The silence felt crushing. What Solomon did not know was what was unfolding hundreds of miles away in Saratoga Springs. He did not know that one of Bass's letters had reached a shopkeeper named Cephas Parker, a man who remembered Solomon and believed the story immediately. He did not know that Parker had taken a letter to Henry Northup, a lawyer and the son of the man who had freed Solomon's father decades earlier. He did not know that Henry Northup had read the letter with growing horror and had begun acting at once. Henry Northup was in his early 50s, a respected attorney with connections to influential figures throughout New York State. He had known Solomon's father and felt a personal responsibility toward the Northup family. When he read Bass's letter, he believed it without hesitation. He knew Solomon. He knew the family. He knew that Solomon had vanished in 1841 under circumstances that had never been fully explained. The letter confirmed what Henry had long suspected. Solomon had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. But belief alone was not enough. Rescuing Solomon would be far more difficult. Louisiana was a slave state, and it did not recognize the authority of New York officials. Under Louisiana law, Solomon was the legal property of Edwin Epps, and that ownership was fully protected. Henry Northup could not simply travel south and demand Solomon's release. He would need legal authority, extensive documentation, and a careful strategy to navigate Louisiana's courts. Henry began by petitioning the governor of New York, Washington Hunt. He presented Bass's letter, sworn statements from residents of Saratoga Springs who had known Solomon, and a detailed account of Solomon's disappearance in 1841. He argued that Solomon was a free citizen of New York who had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved, and that the state had a duty to protect its citizens. Governor Hunt listened sympathetically, but cautiously, intervening in another state's affairs, especially on behalf of a black man claiming freedom, was politically sensitive. Relations between North and South were already strained in 1852, with arguments over slavery threatening to fracture the nation. Hunt needed certainty that the case was legitimate and that New York's involvement could be legally justified. Henry Northup provided exactly that. He obtained a copy of Solomon's original Freedom Papers, which Northup had preserved for 12 long years. He gathered affidavits from multiple residents of Saratoga Springs who swore they had known Solomon as a free man. He documented Solomon's ownership of property, his voting record, and his standing in the community. He built a legal argument grounded in New York law, which empowered the governor to act on behalf of free citizens who had been illegally enslaved. In late November of 1852, Governor Hunt issued official documents authorizing Henry Northup to travel to Louisiana and recover Solomon. The papers included a formal request for cooperation from Louisiana authorities, though Hunt understood that Louisiana was under no obligation to comply. The outcome would depend entirely on Henry Northup's ability to maneuver through Louisiana's legal system and persuade a judge to hear the case. Henry Northup left New York in early December, traveling south by train and steamboat to New Orleans. He carried a leather satchel filled with documents: Solomon's Freedom Papers, sworn affidavits, Governor Hunt's authorization, and Base's letter. He also carried a substantial amount of money, knowing he might need to cover legal fees, travel costs, or other expenses. In New Orleans, Henry consulted a local attorney who specialized in cases involving enslaved people claiming freedom. The lawyer was cautiously optimistic. Louisiana law did permit such cases, though they were rare and difficult to win. The burden of proof rested entirely on the person claiming freedom, and the evidence had to be overwhelming. Still, if Solomon could be located, brought before a judge, and supported by documentation from New York, there was a chance, small but real, that the claim could succeed. The first challenge was finding Solomon. Base's letter mentioned Bayou Boeuf, but the region was vast, dotted with plantations scattered across miles of swamp and forest. For days, Henry Northup traveled to the area, making inquiries, asking about an enslaved man named Solomon or one called Platt. At last, near the end of December, a local resident directed him to the plantation of Edwin Epps. On January 1st, 1853, Henry Northup arrived at the plantation and asked to see Epps. Solomon was working the fields when word reached him that a white man was at the house asking questions. Fear struck him instantly. Had Epps discovered the letters? Was punishment coming? But then another enslaved man told him something that made his heart pound. The visitor was asking for Solomon Northup, not Platt. Someone had come. Someone from New York had actually come. Solomon walked toward the house, forcing himself to keep his face calm, struggling to prevent hope from betraying him before he knew what was about to happen. When Solomon saw Henry Northup standing in the yard speaking with Epps, he almost failed to recognize him. 12 years had passed, and Henry had aged. But then Henry turned, their eyes met, and in that instant Solomon knew that everything was about to change. From the beginning, the confrontation between Henry Northup and Edwin Epps was tense. Epps reacted with immediate suspicion and hostility. A northern lawyer arriving unannounced at his plantation and asking about one of the slaves was, in Epps's view, an outrageous intrusion. He demanded to know what right Henry Northup had to interfere with his property. Henry remained composed and professional. He explained that he was acting on behalf of the state of New York, and that he had reason to believe the man Epps knew as Platt was in fact Solomon Northup, a free citizen of New York who had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved. He presented Governor Hunt's authorization and formally requested that Solomon be released into his custody. Epps's response was immediate and absolute. No. He stated that he had purchased Solomon legally from another owner and possessed documentation proving his ownership. Under Louisiana law, Solomon was his property, and no northern attorney had authority over him. If Henry Northup wished to pursue the matter, he could do so in court. Epps was confident that no Louisiana judge would rule in favor of a black man claiming freedom over a white planter holding legal ownership papers. Henry Northup had anticipated this reaction. Before arriving at the plantation, He had already contacted a local judge, Robert Orton, and secured a hearing. Louisiana law did allow enslaved people to claim illegal enslavement, though such cases were rare and extraordinarily difficult to win. The burden of proof was immense. Judge Orton had agreed to hear the case, and a hearing was scheduled for January 3rd, 1853, in the town of Marksville. Epps was enraged, but he had no legal choice but to comply. He brought Solomon to Marksville on the appointed day, accompanied by his attorney, a local lawyer whose practice focused on defending property rights. The hearing took place in a small courtroom packed with spectators. Word had spread quickly that a northern lawyer was attempting to take a slave from a local planter, and many of the white residents of Marksville arrived out of curiosity, suspicion, and anger. To them, Henry Northup was an outsider, an abolitionist, a threat to the social order. Solomon could feel the hostility pressing in around him as he stood before the court, fully aware that the odds were stacked against him. Judge Orton was a man in his 60s, a Louisiana native who had spent his entire career upholding the laws of a slave state. He was not an abolitionist, nor did he possess any particular sympathy for enslaved people asserting claims to freedom. But he was a jurist who respected procedure, and he was willing to hear the evidence. Henry Northup presented his case carefully and methodically. He began by introducing Solomon's original free papers, issued by the county clerk in New York and bearing official seals and signatures. He explained that Solomon had been born free, the son of a formerly enslaved man who had been legally emancipated, and that Solomon had lived his entire life as a free man in Saratoga Springs until his disappearance in 1841. Henry then submitted affidavits from residents of Saratoga Springs who swore they knew Solomon personally. Statements came from shopkeepers, neighbors, and local officials, all affirming that Solomon Northup was a free man, a professional musician, a property owner, and a respected member of the community. The affidavits included detailed descriptions of his appearance, his family, and his life in New York. Next, Henry presented evidence of Solomon's disappearance. He produced records showing that Solomon had left Saratoga Springs in March of 1841 and had never returned. He submitted a Northup statement describing how her husband had traveled to Washington, D.C., with two men claiming to be circus promoters and had vanished. He also presented Bass's letter, which identified Solomon's location and described his claim that he had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. Epps's attorney responded with his own evidence. He presented bills of sale showing that Epps had purchased Solomon legally from another owner, who had acquired him from William Ford, who in turn had purchased him in New Orleans. These documents, he argued, established an unbroken chain of legal ownership. Solomon's claims, he suggested, were fabrications, possibly encouraged by Northern abolitionists seeking to undermine slavery. He emphasized that Solomon had lived as a slave for 12 years without successfully asserting his freedom. If he had truly been a free man from New York, why had he not escaped? Why had he not contacted anyone sooner? Why wait 12 years to make such a claim? Henry Northup answered by explaining the barriers that had made escape or communication nearly impossible. He described the isolation of Louisiana plantations, the legal restrictions placed on black movement, the destruction of Solomon's free papers, and the fact that Solomon's testimony could not legally be admitted against white men in a Louisiana court. He argued that Solomon had been trapped within a system designed to make freedom unattainable, and that his survival for 12 years under those conditions was evidence of intelligence, discipline, and extraordinary resolve. Then Henry Northup did something unexpected. He asked the court to allow Solomon to play the violin. For a moment, confusion rippled through the room. Epps's lawyer objected, arguing that the request was irrelevant. Judge Orton, intrigued, overruled the objection and allowed it. A violin was produced, borrowed from a local musician, and handed to Solomon. Solomon took the instrument in his hands and paused. He felt the familiar weight, the smooth wood, the tension of the strings. 12 years had passed since he had last played freely, without fear, without the crushing weight of enslavement. Now, with his freedom hanging in the balance, he was being asked to prove who he was through music. He began to play. He played a waltz popular in Saratoga Springs during the 1830s, a piece he performed at countless weddings and social gatherings. His playing was fluid, confident, unmistakably the product of long training and discipline. The sound filled the courtroom, and for several minutes no one spoke. Then he played another piece and another, music familiar in New York, but largely unknown in Louisiana. His style and technique marked him clearly as a trained musician, not someone who had learned by ear in the fields. When Solomon finished, silence settled over the room. Into that silence, Henry Northup spoke. "This man is not a field hand," he said. "He is a musician, a skilled violinist who performed for some of the most prominent families in New York. No one acquires that ability without years of instruction and practice, and no slave trader would invest in such training for someone intended to be sold as a cotton picker." Judge Orton studied Solomon for a long moment. Then he looked down at the documents spread across the table, the freedom papers, the affidavits, the bills of sale. He asked Solomon a series of questions: his full name, his wife's name, the names of his children, the exact location of his home in Saratoga Springs, and the names of people he had known there. Solomon answered each one calmly, precisely, with a level of detail that left little room for doubt. At last, Judge Orton delivered his ruling. He stated that the evidence presented by Henry Northup was compelling, and that Solomon's testimony was consistent, detailed, and credible. He acknowledged that the bills of sale produced by Epps were, on their face, legally valid documents. However, he ruled that those documents were founded on a fraudulent premise, that Solomon had been a slave at the time of sale. In reality, Solomon had been a free man who was illegally kidnapped and sold into slavery. Judge Orton declared that Solomon Northup was a free man, unlawfully enslaved, and must be released immediately. The courtroom erupted. Epps exploded in rage, shouting that the decision was an outrage, that Northern abolitionists were destroying the South, that no slaveholder would be safe if judges began believing the claims of enslaved people. His attorney protested, announcing that they would appeal and take the case to a higher court. But Judge Orton's ruling stood. He ordered Epps to release Solomon into Henry Northup's custody at once. Epps had no immediate legal remedy. An appeal could take months or years, and until then, Solomon was free. On January 4th, 1853, Solomon Northup walked out of the courthouse in Marksville a free man. He had been enslaved for 12 years, 9 months, and 15 days. And now, suddenly and almost impossibly, he was free. The journey back to New York took nearly 2 weeks. Solomon and Henry Northup traveled by wagon to New Orleans, then by steamboat up the Mississippi River to Cairo, Illinois, and from there by train to the northern states of Albany, and finally to Saratoga Springs. Every mile felt unreal to Solomon. He was traveling as a free man, not as property. He could speak openly, move without permission, make decisions for himself. Yet he was moving through a country still deeply divided over slavery, where the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even free black people could be arrested and sent south on the slightest pretext. Henry Northup remained with Solomon throughout the journey, partly to provide legal protection and partly to ensure that he arrived home safely. During the long hours of travel, Solomon told Henry the full story of his 12 years in Louisiana. The plantations, the masters, the brutality, and the small, quiet act of resistance that had allowed him to survive. Henry took notes, understanding that Solomon's testimony was historically significant and needed to be preserved. They arrived in Saratoga Springs on a cold January afternoon. Solomon had sent a letter ahead from New York City, and knew he was coming, but she had scarcely allowed herself to believe it was true. When Solomon walked to the door of their home and collapsed into his arms, sobbing, she had waited for 12 years, never remarrying, never abandoning hope, even when others told her he must surely be dead. The children were there as well, though they were children no longer. Elizabeth was 24 years old, married, with a child of her own. Margaret was 22 and also married. Alonzo was 19, working as a laborer. They had grown up without their father and barely remembered him, yet they welcomed him home. Slowly, over the weeks and months that followed, they began the difficult work of rebuilding their relationships. News of Solomon's return spread quickly throughout the region. People came to see him, to hear his story, to confirm that he was truly alive. Some were genuinely joyful. Others were merely curious, skeptical, or openly hostile. There were residents of Saratoga Springs who doubted his account, who believed he must have run away and fabricated his story to excuse his absence. But Solomon had proof. He had Judge Orton's ruling. He had affidavits from Louisiana. He had Henry Northup's testimony. And he had his own detailed, consistent account of everything that had happened to him. Within weeks of his return, Solomon was approached by David Wilson, a local lawyer and writer who had heard his story and immediately recognized its importance. Wilson proposed that they work together on a book, a complete account of Solomon's kidnapping, enslavement, and rescue. The book would serve several purposes. It would document Solomon's experience, provide evidence for possible legal action against his kidnappers, and contribute to the growing abolitionist movement by offering Northern readers a detailed first-hand account of slavery's brutality. Solomon agreed. Over the following months, Solomon and Wilson worked closely, with Solomon dictating his story and Wilson writing it down, organizing it, and preparing it for publication. The result was 12 Years a Slave, published in the summer of 1853. The book was remarkable for its detail and specificity. Solomon named the men who had kidnapped him, the traders who had sold him, and the masters who had owned him. He described the economics of slavery, the legal mechanisms that sustained it, and the daily violence and dehumanization inflicted. He wrote about the other enslaved people he had known, including Patsy, whose suffering haunted him. And he wrote about the psychological toll of slavery, the constant effort required to preserve one's identity in a system designed to erase it. 12 Years a Slave was published by Derby and Miller and sold for $1. It was an immediate success, selling more than 30,000 copies in its first 3 years, an extraordinary figure for time. The book was reviewed in major newspapers, excerpted in abolitionist publications, and cited in debates over slavery. It became one of the most important abolitionist works of the 1850s, alongside Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass. But Solomon wanted more than literary success. He wanted justice. He wanted the men who had kidnapped him held accountable. In 1854, Solomon traveled to Washington, D.C., to bring charges against James Birch, the slave trader who had imprisoned him in the slave pen. The case went to trial, and Solomon testified about what had been done to him. But the trial laid bare the fundamental injustice embedded in the legal system of Washington, D.C. Solomon's testimony was ruled inadmissible solely because he was black. Under the law, his words could not be used against a white man. The only testimony that could be considered valid against Birch had to come from white witnesses, and there were none. As a result, Birch was acquitted. Solomon also attempted to bring charges against the two men who had lured him to Washington and drugged him, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. But they had vanished. No one knew their true identities or where they had gone. It was likely they had simply adopted new names and continued their work, kidnapping free black people and selling them into slavery elsewhere. The failure to achieve legal justice was devastating. Solomon had survived 12 years of slavery. He had escaped. He had told the truth. And yet the men who had destroyed his life faced no consequences at all. But the impact of his story extended far beyond personal justice. 12 Years a Slave was read by tens of thousands of people, and it changed minds. It offered concrete, detailed proof of how the domestic slave trade functioned, how free black citizens were kidnapped, how they were sold south, and how the legal system protected slaveholders while offering no protection to the enslaved. Abolitionists cited the book in speeches and pamphlets. Newspapers discussed it, and it became a powerful tool in the growing northern opposition to slavery. Solomon spent the remainder of his life in upstate New York. He gave public lectures about his experiences, speaking at abolitionist gatherings, churches, and meetings. He worked various jobs, farming, carpentry, music, trying to rebuild a life that had been taken from him. But the 12 years he spent in Louisiana had left permanent marks. He returned in his mid-40s, and both the physical and psychological damage of slavery followed him for the rest of his life. What happened to Solomon Northup after the mid-1850s remains uncertain. The historical record becomes frustratingly thin. There are references to lectures he gave in the early and mid-1850s, along with a handful of letters and documents that mention him. But after around 1857, he disappears from the record entirely. There is no confirmed death certificate, no grave that can be definitively identified as his. He vanishes, much as he had vanished in 1841. Historians have long debated what may have happened. Some believe he died in the late 1850s or early 1860s, possibly from illness or injuries connected to his years of forced labor. Others suggest he may have moved to Canada, as many free black people did in the years before the Civil War, to escape the constant threat of kidnapping and re-enslavement. Still others fear a darker possibility, that he may have been kidnapped again, targeted by the same type of men who had stolen his freedom once before. The mystery surrounding Solomon Northup's final years is deeply unsettling, but in a way, it is fitting. His life story is a testament to the fragility of freedom, to how easily a person can be erased, and to the extraordinary effort required to resist that erasure. The fact that we do not know how his story ends serves as a stark reminder. For every Solomon Northup who escaped and lived to tell the truth, there are thousands of others who disappeared forever, their stories never recorded. Just when we think we understand the past, Solomon's story reminds us that history is filled with unanswered questions and unsettling truths. What do you think about this story? Do you believe everything was truly revealed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the story and want more dark historical mysteries like it, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who loves uncovering the hidden corners of history. We'll see you in the next video.